Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, the Timberwolves are on Bleacher Report's better or worse list for next year. Are the Wolves going to be better or worse, according to Bleacher Report, based on the Timberwolves offseason? I'll give my thoughts on what they think about it, why I think the Wolves will be better next year than they were this past season. Plus, there's also a list at Bleacher Report of the top 30 free agents in 2024. Next summer, there's two Timberwolves on the list. I'll quibble a little bit with the way that they have the whole thing ranked. We'll get to all that today on the show. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome into the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Happy Monday, everybody. Hopefully you had a fantastic weekend. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, Locked On Wolves is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. More great local sports coverage 24/7, and it's free. All the Minnesota podcasts at Locked On, including this one. Download the Locked On Sports Minnesota app today on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. There's plenty at Locked On Twins. Twins still in first place. The Vikings kicking off training camp, the Golden Gophers playing football soon. A lot of stuff going on in Minnesota sports. So go check out all those shows. You can also follow this show on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and also at my account, which is at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. All right. Last day of July. And this is kind of like list season, ranking season. We'll get into all the different sites that do like the top 100 player ranking soon. That's, I guess, usually September. FIBA World Cup in August. We're going to basically the roadmap for the next couple of months is going to be, frankly, all over the map, to use, I guess, double map analogies. We're going to do a lot of we'll look at some of these different lists. I'll give my thoughts on everybody else's kind of national thoughts on the Timberwolves. This will be like off-season ranking season, like who won the off-season, who lost the off-season, all that stuff, which there's going to be a lot of words, a lot of ink spilled on those topics, a lot of words spoken, and we'll do that here as well. And then we'll get into some really deep roster stuff as we get closer to September. Just like we closed the season with player reviews, and I did anywhere from a segment to 2 segments and occasionally a full show on each of the Wolves players this year. We'll do that, but in reverse, if that makes sense, or the flip side of that, going into the season, previewing every player on the Wolves roster and what my expectations are for them, basically, based on their past performance, based on what I think their role will be this year. So all that's upcoming in the next few weeks. Obviously, FIBA World Cup player ranking stuff in September. Training camp kicks off mid-September, all that good stuff. So there's plenty upcoming. And of course, in the month of August here, we'll be doing 3 shows a week, usually Monday, Wednesday, Friday, basically up until training camp. And then we'll be daily once again. So only a few weeks of 3 shows per week. And then we're back to 5 shows per week. All right. So today on the show, I want to talk about this Bleacher Report list where they break down. It's really, I guess they include all teams and whether they'll be better or worse. It's admittedly I don't want to say it's a silly exercise, but I think it's obviously flawed, right? But I want to read a little bit of what they said about the Wolves and give my thoughts on it. So this, again, a Bleacher Report article, and it was written by Dan Favali over there, and I hope I'm saying that right. But he does a bunch of the usually really good, actually, basketball articles. I think he does a good job at Bleacher Report. So anyway, he says about the Timberwolves, wholesale concerns persist for the Minnesota Timberwolves. Their big man dynamic is at best untested, at worst a sham. Payne Naz Reid only complicates their defining curiosity. He has a viable floor game and did a better job stretching the floor by the end of last season. Quibble with that a little bit, but Minnesota was a decided negative whenever he shared the floor with Rudy Gobert or Karl-Anthony Towns. Side point. I said that back in May into June, when we debated the merits versus potential drawbacks of extending Naz Reid or re-signing Naz Reid, I guess. And one of them was, the power forward minutes haven't been super productive for Naz Reid. He's always been better as a small ball 5. And as it turns out, the Wolves have to play big now. They have 2 max big men in Towns and Gobert, and they want to play Jaden McDaniels at the 3. That means Naz has to play the 4, and he's going to have to share the floor most of the time with one of Karl-Anthony Towns and Rudy Gobert. So I think this is a good point that Favali makes. It says the samples aren't nearly large enough to be deemed telltale about regarding Naz at the 4, which is true. Although I would also add, if you go back a couple of years, that's always been the case with Naz. Not just this last year, but several years going back several years, Naz has always been better as the lone big on the floor than next to another center. He goes on to say Gobert and Towns played in only 27 regular season games together. The Timberwolves projected best 5-man unit. Of course, Gobert, Towns, Conley, Edwards, and McDaniels has a whopping 7 appearances under its belt. Additional time together will improve Minnesota's outlook. It continues to have boom potential. Edwards is tracking toward All-NBA, blah, blah, blah. He goes on to talk about Alexander Walker looking good. Then he says Taurean Prince mattered and Troy Brown Jr. is worse. More on that in a second. But Alexander Walker played tons of 3 in Minnesota. Shake Milton upgrades the bench's backcourt. This team is more than its speculative headlines. Now, I agree with the conclusion. I agree with his conclusion that the Wolves are better today than they were at the end of last season. And I agree that the Wolves are better. And this is something I got on my mini soapbox about, I think it was last segment on Friday, just a small soapbox moment where I kind of allowed myself to get into the national narrative of like, hey, nothing the Wolves can do now is correct simply because they messed up the Gobert trade. And I think both could be true in the sense that Tim Connolly could have made a ton of savvy moves since then, and he could have screwed up the Rudy Gobert trade. Like those things can both be true. And I also understand that making one huge, massive mistake and a bunch of small good ones isn't necessarily equal either. But it doesn't mean that every move the Wolves make is, the Wolves, they don't know what they're doing. Like that's not, and I'm not saying that everyone thinks that. I think nationally there's still a bit of that from some corners of the national basketball media landscape. I also take a bit of issue. So I should say in that regard, I agree with Favali because that's essentially what he's saying. He talks about Taurean Prince mattering and Troy Brown Jr. being worse. This is something we covered pretty extensively last week in a couple of different ways, basically Tuesday through Thursday, and even I think a bit Friday. Broke down kind of the newcomers in Troy Brown Jr., Shake Milton, and then I lumped the Alexander Walker in there too, replacing Taurean Prince, Jalen Noel, and Jordan McLaughlin, who, yes, is on the roster, but likely isn't in the rotation on opening night next year. And I came to the conclusion that, yeah, in a vacuum, Taurean Prince is still a better player and probably fits more teams better than Troy Brown Jr. simply by virtue of his three-point shooting prowess and his catch-and-shoot prowess and his veteran presence in the locker room and on the court, his team defensive ability, yes. But in terms of fit with the Wolves, I actually would argue Troy Brown Jr. is a better fit. And I don't know that I really positioned it this way last week, despite attacking it from a number of different angles. But really, if you think about it, Taurean Prince's best cast is a small ball 4. Troy Brown Jr. is just kind of a 3. Like that's what he is he's kind of a 3, a 3 that can guard the 2 and some 4s. But there's a little bit more legitimate positional flexibility. I don't think Prince can guard many 3s, and I don't think he can guard the point of attack the same way he could a couple of years ago. I actually think his defense has always been a little bit overrated individually. A very good team defender, Prince is. I admit that 100%. And it hurts to not have him in that regard. But Troy Brown Jr. is going to be a better point of attack defender, a better defender for opposing, high volume scorers off the bench, especially. And one could argue that Troy Brown Jr., he's likely going to be better transitionally in terms of defense. He's a better pull-up three-point shooter in transition. He will attack the basket in transition as good, if not better, than Taurean Prince with the youth and athleticism and length that he has. So I do think that there's an argument to be made that if all things are equal, Troy Brown Jr. fits better. And then you throw in the salary, and Prince would have made $9 million next year. Troy Brown Jr. is making half that and only has 1 year guaranteed on his deal. So I think I put it this way at one point, but you let Prince and his $9 million go and you get both Troy Brown Jr. and Shake Milton for the same price, and you don't guarantee year 2 to either of them. It's the exact same thing as having Taurean Prince. But you get 2 players instead of 1. Prince would have expired after this year. These 2 guys both have team options for the second year. So you just maintain roster flexibility in general. And so I would argue that it's not Prince versus Troy Brown Jr. It's Prince versus Troy Brown Jr. and Shake Milton. Or you could, sub in Alexander Walker there too. But I don't know. I think that's a pretty clear win. If you get 2 for the price of 1, and you could argue either one of them in terms of the context of the Wolves roster fits better. Not in a vacuum, but in context of the Wolves roster, you could argue that either Brown or Milton fits better than what Taurean Prince would have fit moving forward. All right. I want to talk a little bit more about this, the conclusion overall that they're better, and then get into the top 30 projected free agents for next year, according to Bleacher Report. So we'll do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends over at FanDuel. Take your first swing at betting MLB on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets up to $200. That's right. Just bet $20 and you'll land $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 you can spend betting everything from the money line to the over-under to who you think is going to hit the first home run in any given game. All that is on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you can get paid instantly. And it's really any sport. Baseball is obviously the sport, really the only sport of the major 4 going on right now. Of course, you have WNBA. We'll get to FIBA World Cup here shortly. Football is about to kick off. Preseason football, I think, starts next week. So there's plenty you can bet on. But really, there is no better place to bet on MLB this time of year than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Sign up today. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball. A big thank you once again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, every dayers later this week on Wednesday's show, we're going to keep talking about the Wolves offseason and specifically Josh Minott. I want to break down a little bit why I think he's going to have a legitimate role this year. And if he may not, if he's not in the top 10 of the depth chart now, I think he will be at some point this season. So we'll talk about that. And then related to that, some of the different aspects beyond the stuff we talked about on Friday's show, some other aspects I think the Wolves clearly targeted to try and improve on this offseason, and that's related to Josh Minott. So a lot of Minott on Wednesday. If you're a Josh Minott fan, or even if you're not, maybe you will be after Wednesday's show. So tune in for that on Wednesday. All right. Continuing on talking about this Bleacher Report article about the Timberwolves, the conclusion by Dan Favale at Bleacher Report being that the Wolves will be better next year than this year based on what they've done in the offseason so far. I think that's clear. And I said as much last week in a couple of different ways on a couple of different episodes. But basically, if you're looking at the roster and you're subtracting, it's actually pretty similar to what I did for much of last week. If you're taking out of the rotation Jalen Noel and you're taking out of the rotation Taurean Prince and essentially taking out of the rotation Jordan McLaughlin, and you could lump in Austin Rivers, Bryn Forbes, like you could take all the guys that likely won't be on the team next year or for sure won't be on the team next year, and you replace them with, we can include Nickeil Alexander-Walker because we're talking, going back to earlier in the season last year, Troy Brown Jr., Shake Milton. That's 3 right there. There's still one of those spots that needs to be filled, but likely Josh Minott, and then bumping McLaughlin down from like your 9th guy to your 11th or 12th guy. That's another way to improve your depth, right? Incremental improvement, subtle improvement in a lot of different areas matters. So if you bump somebody down the depth chart and replace them with somebody in the depth chart that's better, but McLaughlin's still better than, say, Austin Rivers or Bryn Forbes, which I think is largely true, especially the way he played early in the year last year, then clearly you've improved the roster, right? So all that to say, I completely agree with the sentiment that the Wolves are a better team now. And, of course, there's also, like, you could talk about just strictly roster, but then also I guess the other way to look at this article is will the team actually end up with a better record? And as long as they don't have another catastrophic injury, God forbid, but Karl-Anthony Towns missing, 52 straight, 53 overall regular season games. If they have relative health for their, call it big 4, I think we could quibble about who's the best of the, ranking these 4 players in terms of on-court impact. That's a dangerous conversation. I don't know that I want to cover in an episode. But in some order, Karl-Anthony Towns, Anthony Edwards, Rudy Gobert, and Jaden McDaniels, if those 4 stay relatively healthy, assuming that they'll all miss a handful of games here and there, but there's nothing major or catastrophic, this team should be better. I mean, they won 46 games 2 years ago, regressed to 42 last year. This is a team that should be in the upper 40s. I thought last year they'd win 50 plus. I thought they'd be in the 50 to 52 range, I think is what my projection was. I certainly had them in the 3 to 5 range in the Western Conference. And obviously I was very wrong. But I also think the Karl-Anthony Towns injury is largely to blame for the for the deficit in wins from the 21-22 season to 22-23. So all that to say, if you give them relative health and you give them the depth improvements to the roster, and the only real player that's left of consequence being Taurean Prince, I think it'd be hard to surmise that this team shouldn't be better next year than they were this last year. And I think the improvement is actually probably greater than just incremental. Okay. Let's move on to the other topic I want to cover today, and that is this top 30 projected free agents for next summer at Bleacher Report, which is also kind of a fascinating thing to look way ahead on. It's impossible to truly predict because there's so many player options, early termination options, team options, restricted versus unrestricted, the whole thing. But I think it's interesting to dip our toe in, and this is done by Andy Bailey, who, of course, a lot of people, he's a bigger name in basketball Twitter. So if you're listening to this, it's probably pretty likely you follow him. He wrote this for Bleacher Report and tried to look ahead. He based the rankings on age, numbers, observable trends, and then, as he admits, subjectivity at an expected production and role this coming year. And these players look like the biggest prizes next summer in 2024 NBA free agency. So I'm not going to list it all off. There's 30 of them. But like Bruce Brown's 30th, Alec Burks 29, Russell Westbrook 28. So like this is a deep list. Markelle Fultz. I was a little bit surprised to get to the first Timberwolves player this low on the list, and that's Kyle Anderson. He's got Kyle Anderson at number 17 on this list as the 17th most coveted free agent next summer. And of course, he'll be an unrestricted free agent after his contract expires. And I talked a little bit about him. I think it was Friday's show about the possibility of, hey, the Wolves will probably approach him and try and extend him during this season, because it'd be a little bit like the Patrick Beverley situation a couple of years ago, where the Wolves tacked on an extra year. I think it was like in March of that season, kind of at the height of the Pat Bev loves Minnesota and Minnesota loves Pat Bev situation. Then, of course, they end up trading him that offseason. But I'm sure the Wolves will take that approach. The difference is Bev was a few years older and a little bit more limited, whereas Kyle Anderson really still feels like he's in his prime. I think he's going to be 29. Let me make sure I have the right age there. He was 29 this last year, so he'll turn 30 in late September. So he'll be 30 for all of next season. So he'll be nearly 31 next summer. This is probably his last chance to get a multi-year deal, I would think. Now, there's also on the flip side, he's not going to regress as quickly as a lot of other guys because he plays in slow motion, right? Like that's his nickname. He's going to be a solid. The only thing to be worried about would be lateral quickness defensively. Like, is he going to be able to stay in front of guys? He's already a little bit of a limited defender, and he's a very good defender. I'm not at all saying he's not a good defender, but it's not like you're going to stick him on, a dynamic, combo guard in the backcourt, right? Like, there's specific guys you want him to guard and specific guys you wouldn't want him to guard. But he's a fantastic team defender and a good on-ball defender. That's the one thing you'd have to watch out for. His offensive game shouldn't regress much. He doesn't really, he's not playing above the rim in any way, shape, or form. And he's a savvy player. He picks zones apart. He picks his spots where to, spaces out in the corners, hit 41% of his threes this year. Like, Wolves fans know his value. He's going to have interest in the open market. I'd be surprised if the Wolves were able to extend him before next summer, unless they give him a multi-year deal. But of course, the Wolves owe all this money now to Karl-Anthony Towns, Anthony Edwards, Rudy Gobert, Naz Reid, and soon Jaden McDaniels. We'll talk more about him in a minute. So I'd be surprised if the Wolves were able to get a deal done with Anderson before he hits the market, but I absolutely would expect them to try and convince him to take a 1-year extension. Maybe they offer him 10, 12 million. I think he's getting like 9 this year, if I remember correctly. Let's see. I think I have it right here. Yeah, I think it's it's basically 9 million or a shade under 9. Oh no, 9.2 this year. So I'm sure the Wolves say, hey, let's tack on another year at 11 or 12. And I'm sure Kyle Anderson says, nah, let's test the market. And maybe it's a Naz Reid situation. Maybe before he actually hits the market, the Wolves are able to extend him with a multi-year deal. At that point, that's a possibility. But I would expect Kyle Anderson to test the market because, again, once he gets into his mid-30s, he's probably going year to year, or it's a 1-year plus a team option type of a thing. This may be his last chance to kind of cash in, if you will, on the open market. So I was surprised he's only 17. Like some of the guys ahead of, he's just ahead of Onyeka Okongwu, who's going to be restricted. Devin Vassell, a bunch of guys from that draft, he'll be restricted. Tyus Jones at 20, I thought he should have been higher. A handful of the names right ahead of him. Josh Hart at 16. Kind of hard to argue that. Klay Thompson at 15, which is lower than you might expect. Buddy Hield, you could argue that. It's actually not a bad. There's a lot of good role players in next year's free agent class, free agency class. Nick Claxton, and then you get into some of the stars: DeRozan, Anunoby, Pascal Siakam, Tyrese Maxey. So I guess it makes sense. I just kind of assumed he'd be a top 15 free agent next offseason. But I don't know. We'll see. It obviously depends a lot on how this year plays out. You could easily argue that this last year was the best shooting year of Kyle Anderson's career. I mean, he had, I guess it was second best effective field goal percentage of any season in his career. True shooting, I think, kind of the same thing, same neighborhood. So one of the best 2 or 3 shooting years of his career, and also versatile defensively. So Kyle Anderson is going to get paid next offseason, and it makes sense he's on this list. There is another Timberwolf on this list who I don't think will hit the open market. We'll get to that next, and that's how we'll close out the show here today. All right, Kyle Anderson is number 17th on the top 30 projected NBA free agents for the summer of 2024. I mentioned Josh Hart was 16. Klay Thompson was 15. Buddy Hield, 14. Number 13, Jaden McDaniels, a restricted free agent next summer. I'll read a little bit of what they say here in the article. This is, again, Andy Bailey. He says he's had an above-average defensive estimated plus-minus in each of his 3 NBA seasons, 6'9" with a 6'11" wingspan, nightmarish defender who can switch all over the floor, guard various archetypes. His offense is starting to catch up a bit. Talks about career high, nearly 40% shooting from 3, 12 points per game. He can up his volume. He'll make more money as a restricted free agent. And then he says, provided he doesn't sign an extension with the Wolves before then. What could really change his value, though, is a bit more creation, both for himself and others off the dribble. His top 25 placement on this list is a vote of confidence that he'll be able to show a bit more of that in 23-24. Now, this is me talking now. I don't know that he's going to have the opportunity to show a little bit more of that. He may. I mean, there's no D'Angelo Russell anymore. So like that's volume, both usage rate, shot volume, just ball in hand volume that's gone now. Mike Conley's obviously going to check in at a much lower usage rate, but McDaniels is still the 4th option in the Wolves offense, right? Like it's Ant, it's Towns, and then it's Rudy, and then it's McDaniels and Conley in some order, right? McDaniels did turn in, let's see, I lost my stats here, but he did show improvement last season in terms of ball in his hands. Remember, like rookie year, second year in the league, there was a lot of pump fake, one dribble into a bad mid-range pull-up, and then there was kind of this multiple pump fakes, and then he shoots a 3. Last year, he was much more decisive, and that is, I think, the number one thing I would highlight. Yes, he had a career high in 3-point percentage, a career high in field goal percentage, but he also had easily a career high in assist rate. And his usage rate ticked up, of course, along with that. The turnover rate ticked up. But the assist rate was up more than 2 full points last year and 2 points greater than what it was his rookie season. He was more decisive with the ball in his hands. And because of that, he got to the basket a little bit more. He saw the free throw rate tick up a little bit. Yeah, the 3-point rate was down, but Bailey says in this article, if the volume goes up, I don't know that matters as much. I think if he's willing and able to take that and hit it at about a 40% clip, but also willing and able to pump fake and drive to the basket to create for himself and others. Like, he's asking him to do both things there. And I think the Wolves just need him to do one. Like, sure, I know that there was the Scottie Pippen comparison that Finch made leading into last season. Like, yeah, there's some of that there. He's never going to be a point forward in the way that Scottie Pippen was. He's never going to create for others, I don't think. But the Wolves don't need him to do that. So it's balancing that player development. How do you make the player improve, but also within the context of the team? The Wolves have Anthony Edwards. They have Karl-Anthony Towns. They're going to be running stuff for Rudy Gobert. They have Mike Conley to be the straw that stirs the drink. Off the bench, you've got Shake Milton, who's creating. Like, Jaden McDaniels doesn't need to create offense for the Wolves. Yes, it'd be great if he could. Yes, it's better for his development, and ultimately probably if he hits the free agency market. But that's the other piece of this, is I don't think he will. The Wolves aren't going to let him. Now, obviously, as a restricted free agent, it's a little bit different, but the Wolves are going to do what they can to extend him before he ever sniffs the open market. I just think it's interesting to kind of say, like, he's got to be a higher volume 3-point shooter. He's also got to show the ability to create for himself and others. Where's the space for that in the Wolves offense? Again, with no D'Lo, there's a little bit more, but like, you want Anthony Edwards using the majority of your possessions, or Karl-Anthony Towns. Between the two of them, they should be using the vast majority of this team's possessions. Everyone else is just kind of a piece to fit in around them. Now, of course, if Towns is traded, then that's when it's like, okay, now there's more pressure on McDaniels. Obviously, that's another conversation related to, it very much depends on what the return would be for Karl-Anthony Towns, but assuming it's picks and more complementary players, now Jaden McDaniels, you're expecting him to be your second best player moving forward. Even if Rudy Gobert is at the moment, Gobert is on the wrong side of 30, McDaniels would be leading into that first contract extension. So if Towns is traded, into before the deadline in the next 7 months or whatever that is, at that point, yes, you're absolutely expecting to get more out of Jaden McDaniels, and there's no question about that. But right now, where he's the fourth option in the offense, he's, of the guys I just mentioned, he's the only one that's not signed to be on next year. The only one in the starting lineup besides Mike Conley. So, Towns and Gobert have their maxes, and Ant now has a max that will kick in. So yeah, like McDaniels at the moment is option number 4 in the starting lineup. And I don't think the Wolves are really hell-bent on seeing much more shot creation yet from him. But if they do see it, if they feel good about it, then that's more of a reason, or more, I guess, gives them more, I don't want to say momentum, more reason to believe that a Cat trade could be fruitful for the Wolves. If they believe that McDaniels could truly be that option 2 in the Wolves offense and create some offense alongside Anthony Edwards instead of simply being a catch and shoot type guy. But again, he showed signs of that last year within the confines of the offense, which is exactly what Chris Finch wants to see. The assist rate tick up, the usage rate tick up, the free throw rate tick up. That's what the Wolves need to see. Decisiveness, comfort. And I think we saw quite a bit of that last year from Jaden McDaniels. And I thought it increased over the course of the season. He, more than anyone else, I would even say more than Anthony Edwards, has shown consistent improvement over all 3 years in the league. Like, he's consistently gotten better each year. And I think his improvement last year, his mini leap, was greater than Anthony Edwards. I know that Ant made the All-Star team. I know that there were moments that were crazy, but I don't think year 2 to year 3, Ant improved as much as McDaniels. That's a topic for another day, and we'll get into that when we get into player previews at the end of this offseason. But that's where sitting here right now, that's what I believe. All right, that's all we have for you today. Wednesday, we're going to talk Josh Minott. We're going to talk additional aspects of mostly offense that the Wolves were looking to improve upon this offseason, and how Josh Minott, I think, fits into that equation going into the 23-24 year. That's what we'll do Wednesday. A big thank you once again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms, wherever you like to listen to podcasts. You can find this show. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can also follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves, and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.